that actually was arose, since this is not for specialists or anything, how many people need a kind of just a run through of Walker Percy's life, some of his books? Okay, sure, okay. Should I do that? Or?
Sure.
Oh, okay. So, well, first of all, welcome. I'm sure Paul will be coming in any second. This will be a good kind of feeder for that. We're calling this Lost in the Cosmos 2.0, Reconsidering Walker Percy in the 21st Century. And Lost in the Cosmos was a selection of essays of his kind of philosophical, semiotic kind of understanding of where we were in modernity, and a kind of a diagnostic novelist. He would even call himself that. Walker Percy he died in 1990. Was a Southern Catholic writer. Came to fiction kind of late. He studied to be a doctor at Columbia. It was Columbia, wasn't it? Yeah. Had become a doctor, and as he said somewhere, something that from being a diagnostician of the body to the diagnostician of the soul, interested in story, in philosophy, and his novels are all very philosophical. He won the National Book Award for The Moviegoer, and at the same time, around the time of Flannery O'Connor's late in her life, and they did correspond a little bit. I have to always mention Flannery O'Connor and everything I say up here apparently. But he went to medical training. He had tuberculosis, and so he knew what that was about. And it was really during his convalescence that he was reading the great existential writers, reading Thomas Aquinas. He was really diving deep into it. His works, as our panelists are going to really do the deeper dive in that, his works really do try to diagnose the malaise of the 20th century. He was a Catholic existentialist. I mean, he really saw those kinds of questions of awareness, of the kind of Kierkegaardian moments of a commodity culture kind of becoming the values by which one names oneself and names happiness, names success. And his characters often critique those things, those moments. He died. He two collections of essays, many books. I still think one of the most haunting, hard books to read is his book Lancelot. It's still one of my favorites. I still teach it to graduates. Did I teach it with you? Oh, see, you're very lucky. But it's a very. I mean, so he probes the darkness of both the heart, but also of the society that nurtures that kind of a heart. And his novels have been held up in some ways, like I said, as a kind of a late comer to the Southern Renaissance of writers. Right, he died in 1990. So without further ado, I hope that's a good enough. Obviously. Our panelists are going to speak more about it. I asked them to sit there just so that they can kind of see the people as well. We're going to start actually with Farrell O'Gorman, who in some ways is giving us, as he said, probably the broadest introduction to Percy and why we might reconsider him in the 21st century. We're going to go with Jessica Hooten, who's going to be looking at some more. You're looking at just Lost in the Cosmos, right? Yeah. So the essays, and then Paul wants to kind of do a rejoinder on The Moviegoer, probably his most famous and certainly most talked about novel. So, without further ado.
Thank you. If you've read Walker Percy, the idea of figuring out what to do with your life after college is sort of a theme, and particularly in The Last Gentleman. We have a character who's trying to figure that out. And because of that, and because Walker Percy's father, like his uncle and guardian, William Alexander Percy, went to Harvard Law School, I want to begin with a 3-minute commencement speech from the Harvard Law School just about a year ago. So about a century after Percy's birth, what are people graduating from Harvard Law School thinking about? I think this will set the stage for my remarks and hopefully for the panel as a whole in some interesting ways.
It's late at night and you start browsing Netflix looking for something to watch. You scroll through different titles, you even read a few reviews, but you just can't commit to watching any given movie. Suddenly it's been 30 minutes and you're still stuck in infinite browsing mode. So you just give up. You're too tired to watch anything now. So you cut your losses and fall asleep. I've come to believe that this is the defining characteristic of our generation. Let's call it keeping our options open. Leaving home and coming here is a lot like entering a long hallway. You walk out of the room in which you grew up and into this place with thousands of different doors to infinitely browse. When Hollywood tells tales of courage, they usually take the form of slaying the dragon. It's all about the big brave moments. The most menacing dragons that stand in the way are the everyday boredom and distraction and uncertainty that can erode our ability to commit to anything for the long haul. As I've grown older here, I've also started seeing the downsides of having so many open doors. Nobody wants to be stuck behind a locked door, but nobody wants to live in a hallway either. It's great to have options when you lose interest in something, but I've learned here that the more times I do this, the less satisfied I am with any given option. And lately, the experiences I crave are less the rushes of novelty and more those perfect Tuesday nights when you eat dinner with the friends who you have known for a long time, who you've made a commitment to, and who won't quit you because they found someone better. We may have come here to help keep our options open, but I leave believing that the most radical act we can take is to make a commitment to a particular thing, to a place, to a profession, to a cause, to a community, to a person. To show our love for something by working at it for a long time, and to close doors and forego options for its sake. We need not be afraid, for we have in our possession the antidote to our dread, our time, free to be dedicated to the slow but necessary work, turning visions into projects, values into practices, and strangers into neighbors. We should pick a damn movie and see it all the way through.
Okay. So that is from that little YouTube video is from a motivational speaker bank of videos. And what have we just seen? We've seen a gifted speaker with slick video production and soundtrack. Maybe all I've done here is given myself a tough act to follow. I'll admit that the first time I saw this video, I felt a wave of emotion come over me. But I kept thinking about it. And when later that week I led a discussion of Percy's Lost in the Cosmos, I realized that the social diagnosis offered in the video in many respects resembles Percy's. The society addressed is one diagnosed as radically detached, individuals separated from their embodied worlds, including each other, by screens, overwhelmed by freedom, by choice, stuck in infinite browsing mode. And yet, I think there's something missing from this short Harvard video. I think that the message here finally resembles that which the moviegoers Binks Bowling heard on the 1950s radio program, This I Believe. Now, the Harvard speaker is a mildly jaded creature of the 21st century, and his awareness of how individual choice paired with technological immersion has become increasingly isolating. But at the end, I think he shares some of the sentimentality of the mid-20th century speakers that Binks heard, who say things like, quote, I believe in people. I believe in tolerance and understanding between people. I believe in music. I believe in a child's smile and the brotherhood of man. Unquote. In fact, after watching the Harvard video several times, some perhaps perverse part of me longs to hear Binks' sardonic voice intervene, as it does in the novel, and say, I believe in a good kick in the ass. The Harvard speaker, in other words, is Percy without the irony, and Percy without the Catholicism, though his call to commitment and to particular community is, of course, laudable and quite compatible with Catholicism. His differences with Percy are more evident in his prescription than in his diagnosis, and I'm going to try and say a bit more about that as I go. But I first want to dwell a bit on Percy's prescience in so keenly foreseeing the problems of which our contemporary millennial speaker just spoke of. In many respects, it is simply amazing that an aristocrat reared in Alabama and Mississippi circa 1930 was able to do this. Many others certainly followed Percy in noting America's and the larger West's movement towards becoming a society in which human consciousness itself seems to be becoming radically altered by its own choices regarding technology, particularly immersion in electronic media, and increasingly incapable of distinguishing reality from simulation of reality, experiencing a kind of hyper-reality. By 1981, Jean Baudrillard had published his dense treatise Simulacra and Simulation on this topic. As early as 1962, historian Daniel Burston published his book The Image, seen as a groundbreaking work at the time, documenting the rise of celebrities as people known for their well-knownness via electronic media. But Percy beat them both to it in The Moviegoer, with his description of a tourist who sees the actor William Holden walking through New Orleans' French Quarter, quote, shedding light as he goes. An aura of heightened reality moves with him, and all who fall within it feel it. The tourist can only contrast Holden's resplendent reality with his own shadowy and precarious existence, end quote. Among American fiction writers, it's generally the lapsed Catholic Don DeLillo who gets credited with chronicling awareness of hyperreality in his novel White Noise. But even DeLillo first became attuned to it in part via Percy, and he suggested that as much in writing. Percy's sensitivity to hyperreality, or at least to simulacra, is perhaps surprisingly tied to his experience as an American Southerner, as revealed most directly in his novel Lancelot. What led him to call himself not a Southern but a postmodern novelist, though, was in part his awareness of living at the start of a uniquely tempestuous restructuring of human consciousness in the post-1945 era. And this awareness, which came in part through his reading of Romano Guardini's book, The End of the Modern World, is inseparable from his Catholic identity. Percy would acknowledge that Westerners' tendencies to distance themselves from their embodied worlds via screens or lenses, in a sense, began centuries earlier. But he rightly emphasizes its radical acceleration in the second half of the 20th century. So when I look around myself today and sometimes feel that there used to be a world and then the internet ate it, I don't think Percy would be surprised. When I hear from various secular sources that 30% of all internet traffic occurs at porn sites, I know Percy wouldn't be surprised. When I read that people, in fact, seem to be having less sex in the 21st century, presumably because they'd rather look at their iPhones, I know Percy wouldn't be surprised. This is because Percy, perhaps unlike the Harvard speaker, believes in original sin, and that given choice, individual selves will at times, perhaps most often, choose that which is destructive of community and even paradoxically of self. In his novels, Percy's protagonists become aware of this to varying degrees, but in order to do so fully, they always need one thing: the church. Quite unlike in the fiction of his near contemporary Flannery O'Connor, the institutional Catholic Church appears in every one of Percy's novels, and it does so in the most literal sense. This might seem a simplistic observation, but it cannot be overlooked or overstated. The church always appears, though to varying degrees in different Percy novels, as both presence and authority. Of those two words, I know which one would most likely make our Harvard millennial cringe, and perhaps us as well. But Percy's particular identity as Catholic novelist cannot be separated from his sense of need for the church as authority. This need has in part been attributed to his personal desire for an authoritative voice prohibiting his own suicide, a voice unheard by his own father and other Percys before him. And this need is clearly manifest in some of Percy's most problematic statements, as when he wrote to Caroline Gordon that he wanted to be not so much an artist as a, quote, moralist and propagandist, to ultimately follow the church in telling people what they must do and what they must believe if they want to live, end quote. I would stress, however, that in Percy's novels, authority is not the same thing as power. And in the novels, true authority is both signified by and rooted in a love that is sober, stable, and largely self-effacing. This pattern is perhaps most evident in the priest Percival and Lancelot, but also elsewhere. And such concern with authority has a larger American resonance. Writing of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Toni Morrison notes Huck's ambivalent desire for a loving father to replace his awful pack, observing that Huck is initially fond of the escaped slave Jim, in part because Jim is a kind of father who is nonetheless subservient to him, what every American teenager wants. Yet at the end, Huck is without Jim, lighting out for the territory, and Morrison asks whether that space, quote, so falsely imagined as open, will be free not only of nightmare fathers, but of dream fathers too. Percy fully understands the need for a dream father, and, like Morrison perhaps, recognizes that males may feel a particular need for authoritative guidance from such figures. Without it, they might aspire to the position of nightmare fathers themselves, as demonstrated in the character of Lance Lamar, a character who would have readily hearkened to the faux medieval appeal of Islamic State and perhaps headed to Syria to join them, and who bespeaks a kind of crisis of purpose among younger Western males that is much commented upon today. Without any sort of authority to tell him otherwise, Lance comes to the conclusion that nature, and whatever God is responsible for it, seems to have designed males to be rapists. This is a view that is chilling, but that I have not been able to forget during both the Me Too movement and the most recent round of revelations regarding sexual abuse in the church. Arguably, a mounting sense of a crisis of authority is postmodern too, if the collapsing thesis of modernity is what it is made out to be in recent works of political theory like Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. But for the Catholic novelist in a postmodern world, which Percy identified himself as at times, for the Catholic novelist in a postmodern world, the real question is how best to talk about authority, the church, and conversion. The answer, often indirectly and often with irony. However literally the church does ultimately appear in his novels, Percy knew this well, stressing that a believing novelist such as himself must be aware that he has, quote, cast his lot with a discredited Christendom, in some respects a rightly discredited Christendom, and above all has, quote, inherited a defunct vocabulary. The old words of grace are worn smooth as poker chips, and a certain devaluation has occurred, like a poker chip after it has been cashed in, end quote. In this same essay, Percy mentions O'Connor as a model, but in his novels, he generally demonstrates a different way to approach the truths in which both believe. O'Connor's two short novels both stake out blatantly theological grounds within the first few pages. Percy's, perhaps especially The Moviegoer and The Last Gentleman, are philosophical but not overtly theological, to the point where I've met various intelligent readers of Percy who, despite the literal appearance of the church in his novels, are surprised, indeed mildly bewildered, to find that Percy was a believing Catholic. They are puzzled because Percy knew that in some respects the best way to talk about faith now is not to talk about it sometimes. Lancelot being his clearest example of this, and because when the inevitable glimpse of the authoritative church does occur in his fiction, it is surrounded by so much irony that the reader has the real option to not take literally what is right in front of him. It may be, too, that in this interplay of silence and irony and the church that Percy sees as real presence is where mystery occurs in his fiction and the medical diagnosis prescription metaphor collapses. This is a huge topic to end on, and I can't wrap it all up neatly. But I'll close by saying that Percy's iteration of the seeming exhaustion of the vocabulary of Christianity has stayed with me for about a quarter century now and continues to inform my thoughts as a close reader and teacher of works by authors as different as Cormac McCarthy, Marilyn Robinson, and the Irish millennial novelist Sally Rooney, whose work I read for the first time this summer and absolutely unexpectedly could not stop thinking of Percy as I did so. He's still got things to teach us. Thank you.
be Jessica.
Oh, I thought you said
No, I'm sorry. No, Paul. I think Paul's gonna go last. Yeah, so Jessica, come.
Yeah.
Please go. Sorry about that.
no, it's okay. I think I just misunderstood. Since we already have this up, I might actually try to pull something up because it'd be kind of fun. And Percy loved film. Which one do I want to go with? Let's try this. I told someone walking over here that I was going to talk about Percy in connection with Disney. I'm not sure if I can actually find the scene because I only saw the movie once. We'll just hold it there with that great visual of the princesses and go with that. So Percy knew at the end of his life wanted to even write movies because his whole propaganda idea, he wanted to make sure that his point was understood, right? So Lost in the Cosmos is a way of actually reaching readers where they are and going from that point forward. So how do you reach readers where they are when most of what they're doing is watching TV? And especially now in our current culture, how do you reach readers who have grown up in a social media age, in an age of every whim is satisfied by technology, or like seemingly satisfied to the point where you don't have any longing that lasts past a few seconds? And in a culture where you're still having Disney as your pervasive paradigm-setting stories. And what I mean by that is, I'm a mom, and Percy became much more valuable to me after having my children, which might sound strange. But please look at this awesome picture of the little Wreck-It Ralph character and these Disney princesses. How many of you have seen Wreck-It Ralph 2? Really? Okay, so I'm just going to explain this moment, but it happens in a lot of Disney narratives, but I couldn't believe it was still happening in narratives now. So in the story, the little Wreck-It Ralph character that you see there is instructed by the Disney princesses for where she can find her power. Do you know where she finds it? Where all Disney princesses find it, by looking in a mirror. You have to find some sort of reflective glass, and then you can find the source of your power. It makes me want to throw a screen, guys. Like, to have my little girl look at this movie that she was just enjoying, not realizing how terrible it was going to be for her entire psyche, and then to have her moment of revelation, and it's to look in a mirror. I come unglued. So here's the problem with it from Percy's perspective, and why I think we need Percy to kind of provide an antidote for this way of thinking. Whose eyes are looking in a mirror? Ours. We're seeing ourselves. Are we able to see ourselves rightly? We're subjective viewers of ourselves. Our ability to see who we are is not how we know ourselves. Augustine looked at this problem centuries ago, right? And Percy begins Lost in the Cosmos with this epigraph, we are unknown, we knowers to ourselves, which comes from Nietzsche. It is a given, it should be a given, because all the philosophers have already talked about it, that we can't know ourselves by looking in a mirror more closely. We have to be known, right? One of the things that has really given me a lot of passion in the past few years is how do we become known then? So how can we see ourselves rightly? How can we, in a sense, see ourselves the way God sees us? And so Percy tries to do this in Lost in the Cosmos. So I'm going to read a little bit of the book to you to show you how he's doing this. And this is his goal. How can he get you to see yourself? Well, the first thing he needs to do is get you to buy the book. So Percy, and I think this is helpful for those of you who are writers, right? First thing he has to do is get you to buy the book. So he calls it Lost in the Cosmos. Why? Because it's currently relevant to a major TV series that everybody watched, right? So I'm writing a book right now on holiness and having trouble thinking about marketing. I might just go with #holiness just to see if it sells, and then talk about all the ways you should actually be reading saints' lives and reading literature. So Percy's doing that. He's being subtle, he's being ironic, he's being subversive. Secondly, he calls it the last self-help book. Now, if what I just said was true, you can't actually know yourself just by staring in a mirror, right? Percy's going to go a little bit further. Not only can you not know yourself, you can't know exactly what it is that you need to help yourself, and then you can't provide your own help. So this is going to be the last self-help book because you're going to begin to understand that you can't know yourself and you can't help yourself by the time you finish it. right? That's his goal. That's his ironic subtitling here is actually supposed to point you towards that. And the way that he goes about it in the book is clever. I'm going to open the first pages, which I'm going to skip all the funny extra subtitles. They're great, but he doesn't go there. He begins in a format that is quiz. And he says, imagine that you are reading a book about the cosmos. Oh, do you see what he's already done there? He's been so subversive even there. He has gotten you outside yourself and into your imagination. He has asked you, unknowingly, to become humble before a text. Imagine. Empty yourself of all of your assumptions. Empty yourself of all your preconceptions. And imagine this, right? So he demands something for you. He invites you into something. And he's asking for your participation and response. All the modes that he needs for his story to be effective in transforming you. And he's getting you there in his methods. For all the people who think that Percy was too much of a propagandist, that he wasn't a great artist, I think we just have to look more closely what he was doing, because he's doing something really, I think, exciting and worth emulating here, or imitating here. Okay, so he goes through a list of options. He gives you almost these like fortune cookies. Are you this kind of person? Are you this kind of person? Do you not know what kind of person you are? Right? If you answer to all of these questions, and you got to the end of his litany of self-help questions, and you can't diagnose yourself, then he gives you another little imaginative journey. It's called the Space Odyssey. I'm going to go ahead and jump there, just for the sake of time, and walk through why this little space journey is effective. He ends with what is ultimately fiction in disguise. If you've read The Message in the Bottle, it's a series of essays in which he makes these exact points about who we are and what our place is in the world. But then he invites you to see it in small fictional setup. There is a ship, and it's approaching another spaceship. And the ship is an Earth ship, and it's been orbiting for a while and can't find a place to land. And so it begins talking to the spaceship. Can we please board? We need fuel, we need food, we need to get on board. And the aliens begin questioning them. So the exact same thing that Percy's been doing to his reader, now an alien is doing to a human, right? And so you're asked to kind of play these roles out. I kind of wish, do you want to play roles with me? Would you help play roles?
Oh, you meant me? Oh, yeah, sure. All right. I was
Okay.
imagining outside of myself for a moment.
Okay, so hold this for a second. So I'm going to do the PC3. Can you play Earthship?
Yes.
Okay, so let's just
Again.
start here. Earthship.
True, very interesting. We read, request permission to land. We can exchange much more information by meeting and talking.
Not quite yet. You haven't answered our question about C-type.
What do you mean by type of consciousness?
We are C1s. We wanted to know whether you were C1s or C2s or C3s.
What is a C1?
We told you C equals 1. Int soc psi.
What does that mean?
It means that in order for the individual consciousness to be activated, it is required that there be a soc, a society, that is, 2 or more persons, an exchange of psi, that is, symbols, and int, that is, intersubjective relationship, in which there's an agreement about the symbol used and the thing that is talked about.
Oh,
And you?
we're much the same. Now, may we request permission
Just a
to...
moment. It is still necessary to establish your C-type. We are C1s. That is first-order consciousness. Through centuries, we have learned by painful experience that there are at least 2 other C-types, C2s and C3s. C1s and C3s are benign. C2s are dangerous. Which are you?
What are you say again? What's the difference?
A C1 consciousness is a first-order consciousness, or what you would call preternatural consciousness, according to the dictionary your computer transmitted.
It is? Say again. Preternatural?
Well, something like the consciousness of a child, grown mature and sophisticated, but maintaining its innocence permanently, and avoiding the malformations of self-consciousness, enjoying the beauty of our planet and each other and our science and art, without weariness, boredom, fear, guilt, or shame. Like what you call the Helen Keller phenomenon.
How do you know about her?
Okay, I'm going to pause there for a second, because I want to get you to the C2.
What is a C2 consciousness?
A C2 consciousness is a consciousness which passes through stage 1, and then for some reason falls into the pit of itself.
The pit of itself?
Okay, we're going to pause here. So do you see what he's done? Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you see what he's done here? He's taking our very own Judeo-Christian narratives and he's defamiliarizing them and putting you back in them. Isn't that clever? So what he's done is he's taken an alien perspective on things that we've taken for granted. If he turned to you and said, well, C1s are innocent, Edenic, pre-fall creatures, your vocabulary, like what Farrell was just talking about, would shut down. I know these categories. It's not the world I believe in. Not going to fall for that. And instead what he did is make an alien view you. Well, what are you? You've fallen into the pit of yourself, and he begins to explain what that looks like. It means that you pay too much attention to sex, right? You are overly concerned with violence. You hate on people. You're jealous. You have fear. You have guilt. You don't love beauty when you should. And all of a sudden, if you missed all of these questions he asked you earlier, you begin to see yourself in that C2. Thankfully, and this is where I have another, again, we're not talking to Percy scholars, but a lot of Percy scholars, when they lament Percy, they say he was only successful as a diagnostician, but at the end, he doesn't ever give us any hope. And this is where I want to confront maybe that idea, where I think he does give you hope. He doesn't just say, okay, now you've realized you're a C2. You're a fallen creature. My book's done. What he actually does is say, okay, there's also a C3, and do you know who they are? The C3 are the ones who realize they've fallen into a pit of themselves, and they've asked for help. They've asked for help not from themselves, but from somewhere else, right? They're requesting help. And Percy even allows you to kind of ask for this help at the end. You end the narrative and it says, there's a character and you're in the mind of that character. Are you in trouble? How did you get in trouble? If you are in trouble, have you sought help? If you did help come? Are you out of trouble? Did you accept help? What is the character of your consciousness? Are you conscious? Do you have a self? Do you know who you are? Do you know what you are doing? Do you know what you love? Do you know how to love? Are you loved? Do you hate? Do you read me? Come back. Repeat. Come back. Come back. So when you're in that final voice, in a way that Percy makes you feel like you're in orbit, lost in the cosmos, and you get to experience vicariously that narrative, do you read? Come back. That, I think, is the great triumph of Percy's work. I think he's meeting very well and then saying, come back. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Paul Elie. Thank you, Farrell, and thank you, Jessica. And I think I always made a point of never saying what Walker Percy would have thought or what he would have liked, but the variety of approaches to his work is something that his work suggests he would find congenial. There were three of us doing riffs on Percy in distinctly different ways. A year or so ago, I was asked to introduce or to write the afterword to the new FSG edition of Walker Percy's novel, The Moviegoer. And the reason they needed a new afterword, reason that was a new edition at all, many of you know, Farrell, Straus, and Giroux published all of Percy's work except his first and best known novel. That was published by Alfred A. Knopf. Mr. Knopf, who ran the firm at the time, didn't even know the book had been published by his firm, really. It then was shortlisted for a prize. He had another book on the shortlist. He wanted that book to win. Percy's book won. Percy was a little miffed by the lack of attention that Mr. Knopf gave him at the awards, and then shortly afterward encountered Robert Giroux, who became the editor of most of his later work. So FSG ever after wanted to grab this first book out of Knopf's hands and put it with all the others. So they needed afterward to re-up it for copyright, and I was their third choice. I shouldn't tell you that, but it was late. And the other two choices were famous people. And so I thought to myself, well, okay, I'll take it. This is a great opportunity, but I'm going to make sure that I'm going to outdo what you could do. I'm going to really try to go fresh into this novel instead of just kind of trotting out some things for high school students or whatever. Let me really take a fresh run at the book, and take a look at how it came about and where it fits into Percy's body of work that it's now being united with really for the first time. So I took the strategy that is being taken all over this part of Chicago this weekend, and I reached out to Flannery O'Connor. Can't lose with Flannery. She's got so many good remarks. You could just frame your own work in terms of hers and take some of that special super aliveness. Some of you here will know the reference that I'm making right there to super aliveness in O'Connor's work, and bring it into your own work. So I used a quote of O'Connor's about how she was writing about, she was trying to create a certain kind of Southern fiction that went against the typical. Now, the she that she referred to was usually in the male pronoun. The Southern writer, he is trying to do something, this kind of thing, but it was an account of what she was trying to do. And she wrote about trying to make a novel that tilted away from the typical and towards mystery and the unexpected. A novel rooted in some experience which you're not accustomed to observe every day, which the ordinary man may never experience in his ordinary life. Yet the characters have an inner coherence, if not always a coherence, to their social framework. Their fictional qualities lean away from typical social patterns toward mystery and the unexpected. So I then looked at the novel in light of that remark of O'Connor's, and I was really struck by just how atypical a novel it is. It's a Southern novel, but unlike so many Southern novels of the period, it doesn't have a heightened or Gothic quality, almost the opposite. It looks at ordinary experience and with an intense level of scrutiny. It promises a moviegoer, but it's not really about movies or a moviegoer. It's not about a typical moviegoer. It's about the inimitable Binks Bowling. It's a Southern novel, but scant reference to the Civil War, to racial conflict, old houses, barrel-aged whiskey, the notion of the South where people sitting around telling tall tales on the porch, who have a tragic history that binds people of different races together. Not much of that. It's a novel of New Orleans, but it's not a lot of what we typically associate with New Orleans in the novel. The protagonist winds up missing Mardi Gras at a stockbrokers convention in Chicago. It's a Catholic novel. The main action ends on Ash Wednesday, but the main character considered himself not much of a Catholic at all, a skeptic whose unbelief was invincible from the beginning. And he tells us, "I have only to hear the word God, and a curtain comes down in my head." It's at this point we can see a very distinctly American novel, but it stands apart from the main line of the novel, from Hawthorne to Twain to James and Wharton, and then to Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Willa Cather, which usually involves the double helix of innocence abroad or innocence at home. It owes more to certain European philosophical novels. Weirdly enough, it also owes something to The Great Gatsby, which I hadn't realized until my sons were reading that book in school shortly after I put this piece together. It's a novel of the search, the pilgrim's search outside the self rather than the guru's search within, is how Percy liked to put it. But it doesn't have the usual signposting of search novels. No journey to a strange culture, no savvy guide, no sloughing off of oneself and taking on of another, no raft and river, no feasting or fasting, no new world at the end of the journey, just everydayness and the slight diversion of that overnight train ride, Chicago. Coming of age novel, but the protagonist is coming of age is 29, about to turn 30, twice the age of Huck Finn and Holden Caulfield. That's the time in which men are practically middle-aged in the American South of that period. In all these ways, the novel is atypical. It's atypical, too, in that, as was singled out at the time, a relatively unknown author who was in his middle 40s won the National Book Award, and a career, a public career, was really launched in that moment. Percy gave an address at the National Book Awards ceremony, and then he appeared on the Today Show the next day. The address brought together some ideas that he'd worked out. They're typically called philosophical essays that he'd been writing in the years before he turned his focus to the moviegoer. And they had to do with the 20th century as a particularly flawed and blighted time, and with the possibility of the novel as a tool of diagnosis and the novelist as a kind of diagnostician. He disavowed the direct role of the novel as diagnostic, and then yet said, well, but there are certain things that you can do with a novel that are pretty much diagnostic. And then he concluded by saying that the novel is a modest restatement of the Judeo-Christian idea that man is more than an organism in an environment, more than an integrated personality, more even, and you can hear some of the language that Jessica was using in Lost in the Cosmos in this, more even than a mature and creative individual, as the phrase goes. He is a wayfarer and a pilgrim. Well, reading that, I was struck by the gap in tone between the confident statement of intentions in the National Book Award acceptance speech that Percy gave and the more furtive and fragile and enigmatic narration of Binks Bowling himself in the novel. And then I, having written a book that tells the story of Percy's life and work, kind of walked back and reminded myself of just how a few things came together in his life. He was a little-known writer, doctor who had ceased to practice. He was writing philosophical essays that were not much read, and he was, in complex ways, a person who understood writing as a form of communication. So if you're not being read, you're not really communicating. So he wished to communicate. He also came from a family that had a tradition of the men being public figures and leaders. For him to become a novelist was to go away from all that, but the victory of the moviegoer at the National Book Awards suddenly brought him back into public life. Suddenly, Percy, who had tacked away from the public life approach of his Uncle Will and other forebears, one a senator and one a governor, I think, was up there making a speech about the human condition. It was a tremendous speech, and the idea of Percy as a diagnostician has characterized the interpretation of his work ever since. And it's it's effective, it's true, it's original. It's in the term or set of terms that I find myself using again and again, the terms of Harold Bloom's for outstanding, authentic literature. It's strong and strange. The idea that this Southern man born to the manor is going to be a diagnostician in a quasi-scientific way, but do it through literary fiction. It's still strong and strange. It's a tremendously powerful way of seeing Percy's work. That said, it has a certain big disadvantage, and it disadvantage is that it keeps us from seeing just how strong and strange the moviegoer is, and how much Percy was finding his way with this book that's really his definitive book, and that the sense of himself as a diagnostician, which may have been present while he was writing it, really firmed up only later as he became a successful and even famous public figure who was asked to make speeches and so forth. There's another distinction that I found really useful in thinking about literature and writing about it and teaching for a few years. I've gotten so familiar with it that at some point I'd better go back and check to make sure I'm getting it right. It's from Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, published in '57, I think. So at the very moment when Percy was putting together those philosophical essays and thinking about a kind of scientific humanism in Covington. He distinguished between two types of literature having to do with psychology. The psychological novel, that's a novel that's about psychological processes. And he saw the embodiment of that as the novels of Henry James. And then there's the novel that is itself a piece of psychology that's an extruded piece of the author's psyche. And that, the example that he used, one is the novels of Rider Haggard, whose work I don't know, and the other was Moby Dick by Melville. That it's not about psychological process. You're getting the unprocessed psychological material going right onto the page. I found this just incredibly useful distinction, and right now I want to apply it to the idea of mystery as it figures into Percy's work. Catholics always used to talk about mystery. I never quite got it. But if you deal in this literature, you have to make reference to mystery and come up with a working definition. When in doubt, go to Flannery O'Connor. So she refers to the mystery of our position on Earth. That's what the proper topic of fiction is for her. Percy, here and there, he associated with the word mystery his idea that we're mysteries even to ourselves. How can it be that we can come to know everything except the mystery of what it is to be born, to live, and to die? To know what we're supposed to do with our lives and what this span of time on Earth is really about. So I'd like to apply this distinction about mystery to Percy's work to try to get us back to that mysterious place where he wrote The Moviegoer. To me, The Moviegoer is an extruded piece of mystery. It's about the mystery of our position on Earth, the mystery of what it means to find a purpose in life. It has that about quality, but more than that, it's just itself mysterious. And I think because Percy's self-account as a diagnostician is so strong, we can just forget that he was working in the dark, and this book doesn't really add up too much. It has a power that transcends clarity in a way. After that, he gives us National Book Award speech. I would say that most of his subsequent fiction is about mystery rather than being mysterious. He knows what he's trying to do, and he's doing it. It's more exposition than exploration. And that's not defaulted, but it's just something different is going on. There's a couple exceptions. The passage where somebody goes underground in The Second Coming, that to me is truly like an extruded piece of mystery. And if you read Murakami's Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, there's a similar thing where a highly self-conscious novelist suddenly goes into a weird place where he doesn't understand what he's doing. It's really exciting. Percy's essays are, really about mystery. But most of them after that National Book Award speech, again, he's a clear, working, intentional thinker and writer who figures things out, but he's working in the light. Exception, Lost in the Cosmos. It's just so strange that he would go into this self-help book that deals with science fiction in a TV series in dialogue mode, studying the thing with pop culture references that are going to go out of date, and he knows it, and he just lets it rip. That is a mysterious book. Yes, it's about mystery, and it kind of trumpets that with its cosmos references, etc. But it's also it's an extruded piece of this dialogue that he was having with him, and even his pre-verbal self that he was trying to work out on the page. And there are certain parts, I think, of the Thanatos Syndrome that are also mysterious and not just about mystery. Some of the Fire Tower stuff with Father Smith, that more than anything. But just to go back to The Moviegoer, this is a novel that it sits at the head of his work. It's the best known, best read, best selling, and yet it's different from so much else of what he's done because we can feel him figuring it out as he goes, and with the help of a gifted editor, Stanley Kaufman, rather than working things out clearly for himself. The mystery that it partakes of, I find best expressed by a novelist of a generation later than Percy, Don DeLillo. He, in one of the great literary interviews of all time with Tom LeClaire in 1982, spoke of the qualities of novels that emboldened him to write fiction and fiction of a particular kind. There's a drive and a daring that go beyond technical invention. I think it's right to call it a life drive, even though these books deal at times very directly with death. No optimism, no pessimism. No homesickness for lost values, for the way fiction used to be written. These books open out onto some larger mystery. Southern, Catholic, ironic, oblique. The moviegoer doesn't quite add up. What is it about? What has come of Binks Bowling's search? What has prompted Binks to settle down with Kate and embrace everydayness with quasi-religious devotion? It is impossible to say, Binks remarks in the last line of the novel proper. It is impossible to say. And yet, the moviegoer, like its central character, has an inner coherence. Its take on everydayness has the quality of wonder that is the novel's true subject. It opens out onto some larger mystery, one that he, no less than we, no less than he, are still trying to solve. Thank you.
I'd ask the three of you if you'd come up here now. I think all those microphones are on, right? They're not on yet, okay.
That would be nicer, wouldn't it? You know, there's the good-looking guy.
There he is. Oops.
Yeah, I'll let you do it.
And so maybe, well, first of all, thank you very much. And I think it is, because Percy's such a philosophical writer, I mean, he's really great in classrooms. But it is true that I hear over and over again about the moviegoer, like, well, then what's it all about? You know, it's one of those things that where the ending in some ways is almost deficient to the coherence that's going on. And you spoke a little bit about that. I know if it wasn't Percy himself, it was somebody else who said it was like Kierkegaard without the leap of faith, but you didn't see where the leap happened in the novel. And so I was just wondering if we just would go at that one story, and how do you see that existential Kierkegaardian sense of that? Do you see that in many ways Percy is trying to channel that kind of existential Christian moment and trying to put it in a Southern Catholic idiom? Anybody? Nobody?
I think he did that. That was part of what he was trying to do, but the authors in the room can, I hope, support what I say, that what an author's trying to do and what actually happens are often two different things. My way of understanding it is that is by comparing it with again, go to Flannery O'Connor, with Hazel Motes and Wise Blood. Motes, at the end of Wise Blood, is facing the possibility of faith. He's like 51 to 49 for faith at the end of the book, as I read it. And the same thing with Binks here. The modulation is dramatic in Wise Blood. The man has put stones in his shoes and wrapped barbed wire around him and quicklime in his eyes and so forth, to walk in the dark so that he can see what he couldn't see with his literal eyes. In the moviegoer, the slightest shift of register suggests that the possibility of the search is not just notional, it's now real, and that it involves, in some respects, religious faith. So it's just that slight modulation. I'll stop talking, but one more point. I think that slight modulation is what makes this novel really the first work of a whole strain of contemporary American fiction, a lot of which had nothing to do with religion. A lot of stuff that was in the New Yorker in the 70s and 80s that traced the slightest movement of a character from one disposition to another.
I think what's important that happens at the end of the moviegoer is that Binks comes to a realization that his doubt is actually the other side of it is faith. So when he says it is impossible to say 3 times, I mean, what he's talking about is it possible to say that it's just some guy going through the Catholic ritual, getting the ash on his foreheads, or is there some dim, dazzling trick of grace? It's impossible to say. And he realizes that the very open possibility, the fact that it is impossible, means that it is possible. And so he kind of lives out that kind of understanding of faith, with the door always open, that doubt and faith are two sides for him, and begins to see his trajectory through that light.
That's really good. And Jessica was quoting from the final lines of the novel. Percy's protagonist isn't just saying it's impossible to say about a general truth. He's looking at some people going into church on Ash Wednesday and musing on what's leading them there in the words that Jessica used.
I'll just say that, in reference to what I said about the institutional church and so on, one thing that's interesting in The Moviegoer is I think it is the only novel where there's not actually Catholic clergy really involved. It's the layperson, right? That layperson who's gone in the church and exited and, right, being meditating. Why is he doing this? Is it for show? There's a reference to the Eucharist that Binks' his young cousin, right, is so devoted to. But it's really it's the actions of lay people, it's the sacrament, it's the Eucharist in particular, and Ash Wednesday that function there as the signs of the institutional church. And I'll just say too that I think I agree with Paul's general thesis about The Moviegoer having a quality of mystery that is maybe deeper than some of the other novels, right? And that Percy does tend to exposition, particularly in the Thanatos Syndrome, some of the later works. Whereas reading The Moviegoer, I have the experience of something happening to time when I read The Moviegoer. I read, and I think I've been reading for an hour, and I've only read for 20 minutes, and it's not because I'm bored, but because something's happened. So I do think that Percy's narrative in The Moviegoer is distinctive in many ways.
It may be, too, that that's just a function of the way publishing works. Once you've won the National Book Award, they edit you less. When he was a emerging first novelist, they put a real bulldog editor on him, Stanley Kaufman, who was also the movie critic for the New Republic. And Kaufman said, get rid of this, get rid of that, get rid of the other thing. And that's one reason why it has a different texture than the later books.
Perhaps one more question, then we'll take it, then we'll ask others. So we call this, 2.0, trying to reboot maybe Walker Percy a little bit here. And I guess Farrell kind of spoke most directly to that, although I think you exposed a way of thinking about why he's so important. And so is there something about this turn of the century, this 21st century, that you can speak to, maybe specifically that because Percy's novelistic kind of format does feel like a late century novel. Kind of, it meanders in the way that David Foster Wallace meanders, but not nearly as much as he meanders. But there's a sense of a different kind of texture, I think, to the writing. And so maybe if you were to do the 2.0 part in a specific claim, how would you say why it's important?
Okay, I'll go ahead and jump in. I have found myself turning more to Percy, not just because students really respond to him the way they respond to Vonnegut or Wallace or something, where they really enjoy Percy's postmodern bent, is what it feels like when they're reading it. But more so because he makes them feel a truth that they intuited but didn't have a name for. When the rest of the culture doesn't like the idea of guilt, Percy is as big on the sense that, yes, you are guilty of something. While they may feel like they're guilty, everyone tells them, like, don't have the mom guilt when you're feeding Pop-Tarts to your kids. Like, no, you actually should, and then you should ask someone for help and they will bring you a lasagna. Like, don't just celebrate that you gave your kids Pop-Tarts online for dinner or whatever. And they are able to look at Percy's characters and say, oh, that's what I'm feeling. This is guilt. And if I'm guilty, maybe that sin thing is real. And if the sin thing is real, then what's the solution? In a way that maybe others haven't in the past. It's always there in different forms, right? But maybe the blindness to it is coming out in new forms, and Percy provides a greater lens to be able to see again.
That's great. Anybody else want to comment before we?
Yeah, I think I'll just say briefly that, if we're thinking about narrative Lost in the Cosmos, again, I know not everybody here knows Percy equally well, but the whole last self-help book format is really engaging. And I found in preparing for this talk, I went back and checked. I found an interview in I think it's the Atlantic from the late 90s with Sven Burkert's identifying Lost in the Cosmos as the first novel about the online medium, or the first online novel, which of course it's not actually online, but he was suggesting that there's something about the formatting of Lost in the Cosmos that suggests hypertext. And so it is a really fascinating book. And I think one of Percy's most teachable, as somebody who's taught different Percy texts, I think it's very teachable in many ways. And it, also, right, Percy is going along with that, emphasizing this whole idea of unlimited choice, right? Some of the things that I tried to emphasize with the video back at the beginning. Percy knows I think that Jessica's actually right, that what he, of course, wants people to experience by the end of the book is the fact that they cannot know themselves, they cannot help themselves, they must ask for help. But part of the lure of the book initially is the idea that they are free in making all the choices, and by the end, of course, they experience that as unsatisfactory.
15 years ago now, I brought out a book about American Catholic writers called The Life You Save May Be Your Own, and did a fair number of events, and people would always ask about who were the Catholic writers, what's the state of Catholic writing. I didn't have a good answer. So I started thinking on it, and then I got a great invitation to give a talk at Notre Dame. So I went out there and worked like crazy, new kids, job, everything, to figure out the next thing going on in Catholic writing. And I gave the talk at Notre Dame, giant crowd, and it was about crypto-Catholic writers. I called Richard Rodriguez the enigmatic Catholic. At the time, he wasn't open about being Catholic nearly as much. The spasmodic Catholic. Dave Eggers, with his early work, he would, work of mostly secular textures would suddenly have a sort of spasm of religiosity. And the dialectical Catholic, Czeslaw Milosz, who's responsible for the term crypto-Catholic, as far as I can tell. Well, nothing happened. I think it's because at Notre Dame, people aren't crypto-Catholic. They're just open Catholics. But 15 years later, I think that's a better way to understand the position of a lot of people in relation to the church, that they're crypto-religious or crypto-Catholic. And I'm writing a book about that now. And I see the moviegoer as kind of sitting as a foundational work of crypto-Catholic writing, more than of the Catholic writing that we're talking about, say, at this conference. And that's the 2.0 read.
Thank you very much. We'll take some questions. Anybody? Yeah, please, Michael.
So I want to pick up on something that Paul said, sort of the tension between what we want, the author wants to say and what it actually says, and connect it to Lancelot. So I was rereading Lancelot this summer. I first read it in your class before Trump, and read it again now. And reading it, it reads sort of like this 300 pages of hearing from, the sexist, racist, kind of 4chan message board come to life, right? And it's deeply upsetting. And there's no real response in the text to it. Like, you get the idea that Percy obviously isn't like endorsing this mindset, but all you get really is Percival, saying, I do have something to say, but you never hear what it is. But I just wanted to hear what your sort of thoughts are about teaching that book or reading that book, and how it might function in the modern moment, because it's, I think, to use the very overused word, problematic, right? Like, there's something about it that's hard.
Yeah, so going back to teaching, I've taught the moviegoer at times. I've taught The Last Gentleman at times. I've taught Lost in the Cosmos and parts of it. But actually, I've taught Lancelot the most. Although every time I teach it, there's a moment when I'm going in the room and I'm thinking, did I really want to do this, because of the language, the misogyny? It's a challenging book to teach every time. But it engages students, and I found it very successful. And I even, in my current institution, we have some pretty pious students, and I'm particularly worried about how they'll react to some of the language, but they love it. Many of them. So for example, I taught it in a Christianity and contemporary post-1945 fiction sort of class, and I remember, there was one point where students had to choose about writing about Lancelot or Wendell Berry's Jayber Crow, which is a very different kind of novel, but a much more conventional and less offensive novel, and they went for Lancelot. They were really engaged with it. But the question about Percival not getting a chance to respond at the end, I think it's a very fair question, and I think the question of how the novel might hold up over time is an interesting one. I mean, I think when Percy publishes the novel in 1977, I think he had grown up in a mid-20th century United States where, maybe I'm wrong about this, but the assumption that the priest is going to preach the good news. He's about to start speaking the gospel to him. And the theme of news and watching the news and waiting for the news runs throughout the novel. So I think it's, for me, the novel has always worked in just assuming that's exactly what Percival's about to do. And he ends the novel by repeating the word yes, yes, yes multiple times. I've also had friends tell me, well, that's a cop-out. He's got to have Percival say something. But I'll be interested to hear what others.
Well, you just gave me an idea too with Lancelot. So a lot of Percy's novels, people accuse it of his novels of not actually solving any problems. They just are diagnostic. But one of the things that he's doing that works well is he's not just diagnosing characters, which would go nowhere. He's actually getting his readers to respond. I think that's key for Percy's work. And so when you have Lancelot, if you feel that it's dirty and gross, yay! Like humanity still exists within people, that you are turned off by things you should be turned off by, right? To quote O'Connor's prayer journal, right? She says, we've lost our ability to retch, right? Things that should make us vomit, they just don't anymore. We become immune to them. And so Lancelot is a novel that is trying to press that button and say, like, do you still think this is gross and wrong? And then, of course, Percival is responding, yes, yes, yes. And it allows you now to step into the text. And most of his novels do that. They end with, right, at the end of Thanatos Syndrome, well, it just opens it up to the reader. It's almost an invitation now for the reader to respond. And I think he's always doing that, is saying, here's, feel this, really feel this, and then respond, please.
I think the novel so deconstructs too what you expect, and so the rawness and has an authenticity to it, and he's doing so much to the reader, making them kind of think about their own lives, their own sense of how this, and then trying to find the clues, but the clues are not there. And so there is a sense. I never teach this with undergrads. It's interesting that you do. I always teach the moviegoer with undergrads, and I teach Lancelot with graduate students, because I'm not ready for the undergrad's reaction. I'm ready for the graduate students. But every time I reread it, there is this sense of a rawness to it that wakes you up. It makes you think about not only what's going on in the text, but everything around you. I mean, I've never read another novel where I'm always thinking about, as you said, in a post-Trumpian world. I mean, or in a Trumpian world. What am I saying? That there's a sense that there's always something around it. Whether it was reading it in the 80s, the 90s, it almost insists on a kind of a communal, social sense of what's wrong with us. So yeah, I don't know if anybody else on that one, but do read it, and do have that moment when you're going to throw the book across the bed. Anybody else on a question, please?
So in the moviegoer, when Binks Bolling is about to launch his search just before his 30th birthday, what makes his search different from just self-absorbed, navel-gazing, frou-frou, finding myself?
I thought I'd said enough, but I'd pause because I'm not really sure. Thinking aloud, I would say that what Percy said is the pilgrim's search outside the self rather than the guru's search within. He doesn't have Binks say that, but what goes on as the search gains steam is not introspection. he's facing outward toward the world, a world of surfaces in many respects, but he's faced outward. I think what makes the novel original but also enigmatic is that it's not too clear about that. That what you're feeling is the authenticity of a person who's suspended between immaturity and maturity more than knowing what he's after. He feels like a 29 and 364, 365 type person who doesn't know what's next. It feels emotionally true.
If I could just add a couple of things to that. So one, the outside of self means that he's looking in his concrete particularity in the world around him, which would be different than going into yourself, into your own space, closing your eyes. He doesn't do that. So his search actually is through concretes. It's very important for what he's doing. Second, so in Message in the Bottle, Percy talks about someone who is thirsty and by themselves on an island. If you offer them diamonds, you've offered them the wrong thing, right? But if you offer them a message that says, here's where the water is, you're offering them what they need, right? And so I think what Binks is looking for is water in a world that is offering diamonds. And the reason I bring that up is because I think that for our young people, that sounds, I suddenly aged saying that. For when I'm thinking of my students in particular, they really want messages that are bringing them things they don't need. So when they turn inwards, they're looking like, God has called me to be CEO of a business, right? That's great that you just received a message that you're going to get diamonds. What you actually need is water. You need this, right? And so if a turn or a search leads them to an answer that fits with their need, I'm all for it, right? And I think that's what Binks has to find. He has to realize his deep gladness and the deep hunger of the world. He has to realize those things that are more vocational and not just the world is offering him. Who are the people? Ned and somebody who are offering, like, they redo their house every summer. Do you know who I'm talking about? I can't remember the names of those characters. Nell and somebody, right? That's what the world is saying that they need. And he's like, that's not what I'm wanting. I'm wanting water, not diamonds. And the last part I want to mention is comedy. This has to do with search, but it also has to do with the post-Trumpian world. Yesterday's panel, somebody asked, like, how do we reach readers now? Because do we yell? Do we shout? Do we whisper? Do we draw caricatures? What are we doing? And I think Percy, the reason he still fits where we are is because of his comedy. I think it was a rhetorical strategy that has been long-lasting and works, and novelists will do well to imitate comedy from Percy because he's showing an ought and an is, and you laugh when you realize the difference, and yet you really had to think about the difference to even get the joke. So comedy is an entry point into big philosophical questions for Percy. So that's just an extra note for free.
Please, for you.
I was thinking about the emphasis on Percy's pilgrimage outside of the self and also his influence in the 21st century. You might find it interesting that today there's a flash route going on at the University of Chicago where a person named David Dervis, he got a PhD in string theory, and he was the protege of Peter Higgs, the famous physicist with Higgs boson and the so-called God Party. Well, also, it so happens that David Dervis' best friend is Walter Isaacson, who wrote books that people know about with Einstein and Steve Jobs and so on. But for both Walter Isaacson and this David Dervis, their formative experience as teenagers was spending afternoons on the porch of Walker Percy and so on. So that type of influence, I think, is interesting.
Thank you.
I actually was just on, Walter and I were the keynotes for the Walker Percy Festival this summer. So Walter was telling stories about watching, I'm just telling, this is just a Walter story. I'm hoping that I have license to use it. But he would spend summers watching Mary Pratt's dad just sit around and drink on the porch. And he said, whatever that job is, I want that one. So I think that's fantastic. He just discovered, if it's a writer, that's what I'm going to be.
Well, very good. I think we have this till just 3:15, right? So I think we have to go. If there's any last question, I would say to that question of the ending of, I've always tried to figure out that I think what Binks is doing and what all his characters it's always the wrong question, like the diamonds, but it's not, you know, we are not who, the question is not who am I, which we think is for 90% of the novel, but it's whose am I? And his characters are always having a gesture, oh, I am someone else's. It's not who am I, but to whom do I belong? And I think that's what happens. That's my way of reading The Moviegoer with Kate. I mean, oh, this is really not about me. Ah, man, my search is somewhere else. So anyway, thank you very much to this great panel.